Welcome back to Superbly Said, Advanced English Vocabulary and Phrases. Head to SpeakDuo.com to practice English on video calls worldwide. Today's SpeakDuo lesson teaches advanced idioms, but its highly engaging title creates an expectation for thematic content that is entirely abandoned in the actual vocabulary exercises.
Yeah, the weakness here is honestly pretty striking, especially for a curriculum designed to captivate advanced learners.
Right.
Because the title promises this incredibly engaging context, right? Like Jimmy O Yang on TSA issues, playing Blackjack in Vegas, and his parents going to his Hong Kong shows.
It sounds super interesting.
Exactly. But then the moment you get into the actual content, it completely drops this narrative.
Yeah, it really does.
The expressions themselves, like a dumpster fire or to sell out, they're taught using incredibly generic everyday examples.
Like the broken projector.
Yes, exactly. You have slides talking about a projector breaking in some mundane planning session or someone buying generic limited edition sneakers. It just fails entirely to leverage that unique hook that drew the learner into the material in the first place.
It's almost like, building this magnificent, ornate coat rack right at the entrance of a house and then making the guests throw all their coats on the floor anyway.
That is a perfect way to put it.
If you don't build the internal structure to support that initial hook, the vocabulary just has nowhere to hang in the student's memory.
Right, it just slips away.
But I do have to ask, is there a risk that focusing too heavily on the specific Jimmy O Yang context for every single example might, alienate or confuse learners who just aren't familiar with him as a comedian?
Well, I think that's a very fair concern, but the narrative context should serve as a memorable anchor, not a prerequisite for understanding.
Okay, I see what you mean.
Yeah, a learner doesn't need to know his whole life story to understand the vivid imagery of like a chaotic airport or a high-stakes casino.
Sure, those are universal concepts.
Exactly. So our suggestion is to weave the thematic elements of the title directly into the example sentences and practice questions, to create a cohesive learning journey where the vocabulary is grounded in a vivid, continuous story.
So let's look closely at how the creator could actually execute that.
Okay.
Instead of a generic corporate planning session, we could frame the dumpster fire example around a chaotic TSA security line.
Oh, absolutely.
Where the scanners break, the alarms go off, and everything just generally goes wrong. That instantly creates a higher stakes, more memorable visual.
It really does. And for to sell out, instead of talking about buying sneakers at a mall, the example could use the context of his Hong Kong comedy shows completely selling out of tickets in seconds.
Right, tying it right back to the title.
Yeah, and for to gamble something away, you just bypass the generic risky business investment entirely and tie it directly to the Vegas Blackjack reference. You're utilizing the mental frameworks that you've already activated in the learner's brain.
But hooking the student with a cohesive story only solves the engagement problem, right?
Right.
Once we have their undivided attention, we have to evaluate the actual lexical payload we are delivering. Which brings us to a critical pedagogical issue. The provided definitions are accurate but lack the comparative depth required to truly challenge an advanced English learner.
Yeah, this is perhaps the most significant functional weakness in the entire deck.
It really stands out.
It does, because the material is explicitly labeled for intermediate and advanced learners, yet it provides these very basic one-dimensional definitions.
Like defining low-key as just calm or relaxed.
Exactly. Defining low-key simply as calm, relaxed, and not seeking attention, or to figure something out as to understand a problem, it just doesn't help an advanced speaker grasp the subtle shades of meaning.
Yeah, it feels a bit basic.
It completely ignores how these idioms function across different social registers, too.
I wonder, though, if we provide an advanced student with too many competing definitions or boundaries for a phrase, do we risk paralyzing them when they actually try to speak? Like, if the ultimate goal is rapid fluency, does adding all this comparative nuance slow their processing speed down?
That is a great question, but true fluency actually comes from understanding semantic boundaries. Advanced learners don't just need to know what a word means. They desperately need to know what it definitely doesn't mean.
Right, the context is everything.
Because if you only give them a dictionary definition, they will inevitably use a highly informal idiom in a formal setting and, embarrass themselves.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
So the suggestion here is to include a nuanced comparison section for each of the phrases. Contrast the target idiom with a similar alternative and explicitly demonstrate its use in varying professional, academic, or casual contexts.
Let's actually walk through these to demonstrate exactly how the creator can implement this, starting with a dumpster fire.
Perfect. So for an advanced learner, you must contrast a dumpster fire with a similar but vastly different concept, like a hiccup.
A hiccup, right.
Because a hiccup is a minor temporary delay. A dumpster fire is a total, unmitigated catastrophe.
Totally different scales.
Exactly. You need an example showing that you might tell a close work colleague that client pitch was a complete dumpster fire. But if you were stepping into an elevator with the CEO, you would adapt it and say, we experienced a few minor hiccups during the pitch.
Wow, yeah. Using dumpster fire in front of upper management is a massive professional misstep because it's simply too dramatic.
It really is. That distinction could literally save someone's job.
Seriously. Okay, let's look at to sell out. We could easily contrast that with to cash in.
Okay, I like that.
To sell out means all physical items or tickets are gone, but for an advanced speaker, they need to know it carries a secondary, often negative implication of abandoning your artistic principles for money.
Right, exactly.
Whereas to cash in simply means taking financial advantage of an opportunity.
Yes. And this is where you can bring in a high-stakes academic context, like an IELTS Speaking Part 2 exam.
Oh, that's a great idea.
If a student is prompted to describe a time they missed an opportunity, they could say, I wanted to attend the concert, but the tickets managed to sell out in seconds, whereas the promoters really managed to cash in on the hype.
That shows the examiner incredible lexical resource and flexibility.
It really does. Now, the material also teaches to figure something out. We should contrast this with to stumble upon.
Okay, what's the nuance there?
If you say to your manager, I finally figured out the software bug, it implicitly communicates that you applied deliberate, focused effort and skill. You are claiming credit.
Right?
If you say, I stumbled upon the solution, it implies luck or accident. Advanced learners need that compass to navigate the subtle politics of the English workplace.
That is a phenomenal distinction. How about the phrase might as well? The lesson currently defines it simply as doing something because there's no better option.
We need to compare it to ought to.
Ought to, okay.
Yeah. If you tell a work colleague, the afternoon meeting was canceled, so we might as well leave early, it communicates a casual lack of better alternatives. But if you say, we ought to leave early, it introduces a subtle sense of obligation, duty, or strategic advantage.
I love how these boundaries instantly make the vocabulary three-dimensional. For low-key, the material needs to contrast it with under the radar.
Yes, absolutely.
Because low-key is fundamentally about a relaxed, unbothered vibe. Under the radar is about deliberate secrecy and avoiding detection.
Right.
Going back to that IELTS exam context, if the prompt asks the student to describe a perfect weekend, a learner could say, I prefer a low-key weekend at home, rather than throwing a massive party. It shows they understand the idiom means relaxed, not that they are hiding from the government.
Exactly. And moving to interpersonal relationships, the deck teaches to lose touch, which absolutely must be compared to a falling out.
Oh, that is a vital social nuance.
It is. To lose touch is the gradual, passive fading of contact over time due to geographic distance or simply having busy lives. Nobody is angry, it's just life.
Right.
A falling out is a sudden, deliberate, and often permanent break caused by a severe argument.
So if an IELTS examiner asks about a past friendship, saying we just lost touch after the college paints a peaceful, nostalgic picture.
Exactly.
But accidentally saying we had a falling out after college invites a barrage of follow-up questions about the conflict that the student might not be prepared to answer.
Right. And looking at the flip side of that, we have to get back in touch. Contrast this with to check up on.
Oh, interesting.
If you tell your boss, I'm going to get back in touch with that vendor, it implies a warm, mutual reconnection to rebuild rapport.
Yeah.
If you say, I'm going to check up on that vendor, it changes the dynamic entirely. It sounds like one-sided monitoring, an audit, or an assumption that the vendor is failing to deliver.
That brings us to come out of the woodwork. This one is so culturally specific, we should contrast it with the simple verb to emerge.
Good point.
If you tell a colleague, when I got promoted,
all these old acquaintances came out of the woodwork, it carries a slightly parasitic, negative nuance.
Yeah, it implies they suddenly appeared from hiding specifically because they want something from you now that you have power.
Exactly. Whereas emerge is just a neutral physical appearance.
Which leaves us with the final idiom, to gamble something away. Contrast this with to invest poorly.
Okay.
If you are analyzing a business case study and you say, the competitor gambled away their market share, you are actively judging them as reckless, foolish, and irresponsible.
Right.
Saying they invested poorly suggests they took a calculated business risk that simply failed to yield returns. Providing these specific, contextual boundaries is what transforms a student from someone who just memorizes a definition into someone who truly speaks the language with authority.
And giving students that kind of authority requires a lesson structure that actively reinforces it, which brings us to our final assessment of the material.
The repetitive placement of promotional slides disrupts the lesson's flow, and the ending lacks a concrete mechanism to solidify the learned vocabulary.
The core weakness here is structural pacing. The exact same AI feedback slide is repeated at the beginning and then abruptly inserted later in the deck.
The one with the specific pronunciation tip about the yeah sound? Yes, that exact one. It completely interrupts the pacing of the breakout rooms and stalls the educational momentum. Furthermore, the lesson simply ends with a passive, thanks for coming slide.
Yeah, that's a huge missed opportunity.
It really is a non-negotiable missed opportunity to assess whether the students actually retained complex phrases like to come out of the woodwork.
Let's look closely at the motivation behind those promotional slides, though. The deck makes a strong case for SpeakDuo's AI analysis features. And as a business, they clearly need to communicate that value.
Of course.
But from a cognitive load perspective, does that structural repetition actually cause the learner to tune out the educational material entirely?
Absolutely. It triggers ad fatigue within a learning environment. When a student sees identical corporate text mid-lesson, their brain essentially goes to sleep to protect its working memory.
Makes sense.
So our suggestion is twofold. First, consolidate the app promotion entirely to the beginning or the very end to avoid interrupting the lesson flow.
And the second part?
Second, replace those redundant slides at the end with a comprehensive, active recall multiple choice quiz. The quiz should heavily repeat the target phrases to reinforce memory and structurally provide students the necessary friction to think before revealing the answers.
Designing a good multiple-choice quiz for advanced learners is incredibly tricky, though. The distractors, the incorrect options, they have to be written in a way that actually tests semantic knowledge, not just basic reading comprehension.
Exactly. When we reviewed the draft quiz options provided in the creator's notes, the language felt completely robotic.
It really did.
The draft language was a perfect example of what not to do. It relied on heavy, unnatural adverb stacking. Native English speakers simply do not talk like that.
No, they don't.
When you stack adverbs that way, an advanced learner will immediately identify the option as fake, just based on the bizarre syntax, entirely defeating the purpose of testing their vocabulary.
Let's actually conduct a demonstration of how to deliver these quiz questions effectively right now, focusing on natural phrasing and targeted distractors. We'll run through the 8 examples from the lesson.
Sounds good?
Let's start with question 1. What is the best definition for the expression, a dumpster fire? Option A, to describe a specific situation that is exceptionally chaotic, completely disastrous, and entirely out of control.
Option B, to deliberately eliminate highly sensitive corporate records to successfully avoid a massive financial investigation.
Or option C, to surprisingly successfully handle an incredibly difficult crisis using a remarkably unconventional business tactic. Feel free to pause the podcast here if you need to think about the answer for the expression, a dumpster fire.
And the correct answer is option A, a dumpster fire is used to describe a specific situation that is exceptionally chaotic, completely disastrous, and entirely out of control.
Right, just like we discussed with the TSA security line turning into a complete dumpster fire.
Exactly. Okay, question 2. How is the phrasal verb to sell out accurately defined, option A, To intentionally, permanently abandon an incredibly successful project due to surprisingly severe creative differences.
Option B, to describe the exact moment when all available retail items or specific event tickets are completely purchased fast.
Or option C, to deliberately loudly promote an exceptionally low-quality product to successfully secure a massive corporate payout. Feel free to pause the podcast here if you need to think about the answer for the phrasal verb to sell out.
The correct answer is option B. To sell out is used to describe the exact moment when all available retail items or specific event tickets are completely purchased fast.
Like Jimmy O Yang's Hong Kong comedy shows managing to completely sell out of tickets in seconds.
Spot on. Question 3. If someone manages to figure something out, what exactly are they doing? Option A, to deliberately, entirely ignore incredibly complicated professional advice provided by highly experienced supervisors.
Option B, to rapidly, violently, physically dismantle a remarkably massive mechanical structure before fully recreating its pieces.
Or option C, to successfully, finally understand a complicated problem or effectively discover a solid solution after enough effort. Feel free to pause the podcast here if you need to think about the answer for the phrase, to figure something out.
And the answer is option C. To figure something out means to successfully, finally understand a complicated problem or effectively discover a solid solution after enough effort.
Like putting in the deliberate effort to figure out that complicated software bug at work.
Taking a specific action is completely reasonable, primarily because absolutely no better option exists.
Option B, to aggressively confront a remarkably difficult professional challenge without requesting any external team assistance.
Or option C, to successfully, smoothly negotiate a significantly lower financial purchase price for a remarkably expensive property. Feel free to pause the podcast here if you need to think about the answer for the phrase, might as well.
The answer is option A. Saying you might as well do something means to declare that taking a specific action is completely reasonable, primarily because absolutely no better option exists.
Right. Like saying, the afternoon meeting was canceled, so we might as well just leave early.
Exactly. Okay, halfway there. Question 5. Which of the following describes what it means to keep things low-key? Option A, to thoroughly, forcefully, quickly clean a remarkably messy physical workspace directly before a highly important event.
Option B, to describe an event or attitude that is exceptionally calm, perfectly relaxed, and absolutely not seeking attention.
Or option C, to deliberately manually suddenly shatter a surprisingly heavy industrial object using a specially designed steel tool. Feel free to pause the podcast here if you need to think about the answer for the phrase low-key.
The correct answer is option B. To keep things low-key is to describe an event or attitude that is exceptionally calm, perfectly relaxed, and absolutely not seeking attention.
Like preferring a low-key weekend at home rather than throwing a massive party.
Exactly. Question 6. What occurs when a person is said to lose touch? Option A, to temporarily, accidentally, completely misplace incredibly sensitive personal documents during a chaotic business trip.
Option B, to actively physically detach a heavy wooden object from its original metal frame to secretly access a guarded space.
Or option C, to gradually and completely stop actively communicating with a specific friend or distant relative over a long time. Feel free to pause the podcast here if you need to think about the answer for the phrase, to lose touch.
The correct answer is option C. To lose touch means to gradually and completely stop actively communicating with a specific friend or distant relative over a long time.
Right, just like passively losing touch with a friend after college without any big argument.
Right. Question 7. What does it mean if people come out of the woodwork? Option A, to remarkably, suddenly, mysteriously appear out of nowhere, frequently because these people want a specific thing now.
Option B, to effectively, efficiently, rapidly utilize a remarkably great initial idea to make further progress on an old project.
Or option C, to correctly, successfully, accurately predict the highly uncertain outcome of an upcoming global political event today. Feel free to pause the podcast here if you need to think about the answer for the phrase, to come out of the woodwork.
The answer is option A. When people come out of the woodwork, it means they remarkably suddenly, mysteriously appear out of nowhere, frequently because these people want a specific thing now.
Like old acquaintances coming out of the woodwork right after you get a big promotion?
Exactly. And finally, question 8. What is the underlying meaning of the expression to gamble something away? Option A, to systematically, efficiently organize a remarkably complicated corporate legal process into easily manageable pieces.
Option B, to completely foolishly entirely lose something remarkably valuable by intentionally taking incredibly risky bad chances.
Or option C, to successfully, scientifically, strongly, safely, permanently effect a change. Feel free to pause the podcast here if you need to think about the answer for the expression to gamble something away.
The correct answer is option B. To gamble something away means to completely foolishly entirely lose something remarkably valuable by intentionally taking incredibly risky bad chances.
Just like recklessly gambling away your company's market share instead of just investing poorly.
Exactly. That kind of active, friction-based recall completely replaces a passive slide with genuine educational value. It demands that the learner actively interact with the nuances we've been talking about.
It really does. It fundamentally shifts the end of the lesson from a polite dismissal into a powerful moment of knowledge consolidation.
So, to briefly recap the core of our critique today, the SpeakDuo material has a genuinely strong foundational vocabulary list. However, it can be significantly elevated by executing on 3 key areas.
Right.
First, align the internal vocabulary examples with the highly engaging Jimmy O. Yang title hook. Second, introduce nuanced side-by-side comparisons for advanced learners to distinguish between professional and casual registers.
Showing them where the boundaries of a word actually lie.
Exactly. And finally, consolidate the repetitive promotional slides and cap the experience with a robust, natural-sounding, multiple-choice quiz to trigger active recall.
It's all about pushing the material from functional to exceptional.
We warmly invite the creator to implement these structural and thematic changes and submit their revised SpeakDuo lesson back in for further feedback. We are always eager to see how these adjustments elevate the final product.